My name is Victoria Hartwell, and last Tuesday, I sat alone in my car in a concrete parking garage staring at my hands like they belonged to someone else. I was 61 years old, the kind of age where people stop asking what you want and start deciding what you need. I had just walked out of my estate attorney's office downtown carrying a thin folder that felt heavier than it looked when Mr. Patterson told me my net worth had crossed $20 million. His voice stayed calm, professional, almost bored, as if he were discussing the weather instead of my entire life. I didn't celebrate. I didn't call anyone. I tucked the folder into my bag, drove down 3 levels of gray concrete, turned off the engine, and sat there in silence, letting the weight of it all settle into my chest. I was thinking about years of saying no to myself, about long work days, careful choices, and the quiet belief that if I kept showing up for my family, it would mean something. That was when my phone rang. My son Marcus's name lit up the screen. I stared at it longer than I should have before answering. He hadn't called me in weeks, not since the last time I had been the one to reach out. "Mom," he said brightly, too brightly. "Are you free tonight? We should do a family dinner downtown. Riverstone Grill. 7 o'clock. The words came out fast, rehearsed, like he didn't want to give me time to think. "Is something wrong?" I asked. No, he said quickly. "Nothing like that. It's just important." I looked at my reflection in the rearview mirror at the tired eyes and careful lipstick and felt a familiar ache rise up, mixed this time with something colder. Suspicion, because when your children suddenly remember you exist, you learn to wonder what changed. "All right," I said quietly. 7. After I ended the call, I stayed there in that garage, listening to the distant echo of engines and footsteps, understanding something with uncomfortable clarity. They thought I was coming as their mother. They didn't know I was already holding their debt. At that moment, I realized the evening ahead would not be about apologies or reconnection, but about truth, boundaries, and the quiet consequences of years spent being taken for granted by the people I loved most. 3 months earlier, my house was warm in a way that only happens when you expect people you love to walk through the door. I had started cooking just after noon, moving slowly, deliberately, the way I always did when something mattered to me. The roast chicken went into the oven first, seasoned the same way I'd done it for years. Mashed potatoes waited on the stove, covered, so they wouldn't dry out. Green beans sat trimmed and ready, lined up neatly on a cutting board. The smell of butter and thyme filled the kitchen and drifted down the hallway, wrapping the house in something that felt like care. I didn't think much when I set the table for 5. It felt natural, almost automatic. 1 place for me, 2 for my children, 2 smaller plates for Emma and Noah. I pulled out the cloth napkins I usually saved for holidays and smoothed them flat, pressing out invisible wrinkles with my palm. In the center of the table, I placed a small candle, the kind meant to be lit during celebrations, not emergencies. At 6:30, everything was ready. I checked the clock, then my phone. Nothing. I told myself they were on their way. Traffic was bad. Someone had forgotten something and had to turn around. These were the excuses I'd learned to make without effort. At 7, the food was still hot, steam lifting gently from the chicken when I opened the oven to check it. I adjusted the heat, poured myself a glass of water, and waited. By 7:45, the edges of the chicken had begun to dry, and the quiet in the house felt heavier. I picked up my phone and sent Marcus a short text asking if they were close. The message showed as delivered almost instantly. No reply followed. I tried calling him. The phone rang until it went to voicemail. I hung up before the recording finished, my thumb hovering over the screen as if it might change its mind and ring back. It didn't. I called Sophia next. Straight to voicemail again. At 8:30, I took the cake out of the refrigerator and set it on the counter. It was small, white frosting, smooth and unmarked, no message written across the top. I'd asked Helen at the bakery to keep it simple. I didn't want to remind her of my age staring back at me in piped letters. A single candle was taped to the lid, thin and pale, waiting. I stood there longer than I meant to, staring at the box. The house felt too still, not peaceful, just empty. I could hear the refrigerator hum, the soft ticking of the clock on the wall, sounds I usually ignored because they blended into the background of a full life. That night, they stood out, sharp and insistent. At 9:15, I lit the candle anyway. The flame caught quickly, steady and quiet. I carried the cake to the table and placed it in front of the empty chairs. I sat down at the head of the table and folded my hands in my lap, feeling foolish and stubborn all at once. For a moment, I let myself imagine what should have been happening. Marcus complaining about being hungry, Sophia telling me to sit down and relax, Emma and Noah laughing too loudly, asking for dessert before dinner. I could almost hear it, but imagination doesn't open doors or pull out chairs. The flame flickered as if it were tired of waiting, too. I blew it out, and the room seemed to exhale, the warmth fading with the smoke. I sat there a few seconds longer than necessary, then stood up and began clearing the table. I wrapped the food carefully, even though no one else would be eating it. I placed the cake back in its box and slid it into the refrigerator untouched. I washed the dishes slowly, methodically, because keeping my hands busy kept my thoughts from wandering where I didn't want them to go. When everything was clean and put away, I turned off the kitchen light and stood in the doorway, looking at the darkened room like it had done something wrong. I didn't cry that night. I went to bed early and stared at the ceiling until sleep finally took pity on me. The next morning, my phone buzzed while I was pouring coffee. Marcus's message came first. He apologized, said work had come up, said he thought Sophia had told me plans had changed. Sophia's message followed, full of regret and confusion, promising they'd make it up to me soon.
Soon.
I read the messages twice, then set my phone down on the counter. No one asked how late I'd stayed up. No one asked if I'd eaten alone.
No one suggested coming by that day.
I looked at the faint ring of condensation the cake box had left on the counter, and something inside me settled into a quiet, uncomfortable truth. I had spent years reaching out, filling gaps, making sure no one felt forgotten. That night, I realized I was the only one still trying. The silence. When you stop waiting for people to notice you, time stretches in unexpected ways. At first, the quiet felt temporary, like a pause before things returned to normal. I told myself I was just giving my children space, that they were busy, that adulthood was complicated. I didn't announce my distance or make any grand declarations. I simply stopped being the first one to reach out. Days passed, then weeks. My phone stayed, mostly silent. No casual calls, no quick check-ins. Just the occasional forwarded photo of Emma or Noah or a brief update sent out of. It started with a routine review meeting. Richard had spread several folders across the table, walking me through recent acquisitions and updated valuations. Most of it was familiar, comfortable even. Then he paused, tapped one document with his pen, and asked me if a particular business name meant anything to me. I recognized it immediately. It belonged to Marcus. I didn't react right away. I asked questions instead. Calm ones, clarifying ones. I wanted to understand, not assume. The property in question wasn't something I'd bought outright. It was part of a commercial portfolio I held a stake in, one I'd invested in years earlier through a private fund. The original lender had sold off several notes during a restructuring, and my fund had purchased them at a discount. It was all standard practice, legal, boring. Even the overlap wasn't dramatic. It was simply there, waiting to be noticed. As we kept talking, another familiar name surfaced. Sophia's business. Different property, same situation, different fund, same outcome. I felt a strange tightening in my chest, not panic, but recognition. Richard explained the structure carefully, making sure I understood every detail. I listened. I took notes. I didn't rush him. These weren't personal loans. There was no secret surveillance. I hadn't been watching my children or digging through their finances. Their names had appeared because the commercial real estate market is smaller than people think, and I had been in it long enough to understand how connections form, whether you intend them to or not. I asked what would happen next. He told me the truth. Payments were behind. Terms were tightening. Decisions would need to be made by the end of the quarter. I drove home that afternoon in a fog. I didn't try to shake. I wasn't angry. Not yet. I was processing the uncomfortable realization that while I had been worrying about hurting my children by offering too much, they had been struggling without telling me anything at all. Or maybe they hadn't planned to tell me until they had to. That night, I sat at my kitchen table long after dinner, paperwork spread out in front of me. I reread emails. I reviewed timelines. I traced decisions back to their origins. Everything made sense. Too much sense. I thought about my birthday dinner, about the empty chairs, about the apologies that came after, carefully worded and light on responsibility. I thought about how quickly people reach for you when they need something, and how easily they forget you when they don't. I didn't sleep much. Over the next few weeks, I learned more than I ever wanted to know. Asked Richard to walk me through every possible scenario. Not because I wanted control, but because I refused to be blindsided. I wanted to understand my position fully before anyone else decided it for me. I never reached out to Marcus or Sophia. I didn't warn them. I didn't hint. I waited. When Marcus finally called me that Tuesday afternoon, his voice urgent and overly cheerful, I understood the timing immediately. Something had changed on their end. Pressure had mounted. Options had narrowed. The dinner invitation wasn't about family. It was about leverage. As I listened to him speak, I realized something else that surprised me with its clarity. I wasn't nervous. I wasn't afraid of confrontation. I felt steady for the first time in a long while. I wasn't reacting to my children's needs. I was responding from my own ground. I agreed to the dinner not because I felt obligated, but because I wanted to look them in the eye and hear what they would say when they thought I knew nothing. When I hung up the phone, I set it down carefully and took a slow breath. I understood the role they expected me to play that night. What they didn't understand was that I had already stepped out of it. And once you stop waiting, you start seeing things exactly as they are. The confrontation. Riverstone Grill was already loud when I arrived, the kind of place where conversations overlap and no one notices if you lower your voice to say something serious. I paused just inside the entrance, smoothing my jacket, taking a moment to steady myself before stepping into whatever version of family waited at the table. Marcus stood up the moment he saw me. He smiled wide, too quick, and wrapped me in a hug that lasted a second longer than usual. Sophia followed, kissing my cheek and telling me how good I looked, her eyes scanning my face like she was checking for signs of weakness. David nodded politely, already reaching for the wine list. They had chosen the table. They ordered first, steak, lobster tail, a bottle of red that required James the waiter's approval. When I reached for my menu, Marcus waved it away. "Don't worry about it, Mom. We've got this." It was a small thing, but it stuck with me. For years, I had been the one insisting on paying, slipping my card to the server when no one was looking. Now they wanted control, even in gestures meant to look generous. The conversation started safely enough. Work updates, Emma and Noah's schedules, complaints about how expensive everything had gotten. Inflation, taxes. It all sounded rehearsed, like they were easing into something they didn't quite know how to say. Sophia sighed and set her napkin down. "It's just been a stressful few months," she said. "Running a business right now feels impossible." Marcus nodded, rubbing his forehead. "Cash flow's tight. Just temporarily. We're fine. Really just juggling a lot." They spoke in circles, careful not to ask outright. No one said the word help, but it hovered over the table like steam rising from a plate. I listened. I didn't interrupt. I asked questions when something didn't add up. Dates, timelines, numbers. Each answer made the picture clearer. At one point, Marcus leaned back in his chair and smiled at me, softening his voice. "You're set, Mom. You've always been careful. You don't really need much now." It wasn't cruel. That was the problem. It was practical, spoken like a fact everyone at the table had silently agreed upon. I set my fork down. "I don't need much," I repeated calmly. "Is that what you think?" Sophia shifted in her seat. "That's not what we meant. But it is what you said," I replied. I kept my tone even. "And it tells me more than you realize." James returned to pour more wine. I waited until he left, until the moment was ours again. "I want to be clear," I said. "I'm not here to argue. I just want honesty." There was a pause, a heavy one. Marcus finally spoke. We were hoping you could help us bridge a gap. Just for a little while. I nodded slowly. I see. I reached into my bag and took out my phone. Not dramatically, just deliberately. I typed a message and set it back on the table. We're not finished, I said gently. When Marcus looked confused, I added, someone's joining us. 10 minutes later, Richard approached the table. He greeted me politely, nodded at my children, and pulled out a chair without being asked. No one else spoke.
The air had changed.
I didn't invite him to embarrass you, I said quietly. I invited him because I refused to pretend anymore. Richard opened a slim folder and placed it on the table, turning it so they could see. No raised voice, no accusations, just facts. I hold the primary notes on the properties your businesses lease, I continued. Not because I went looking for you, but because this is the market I've been in for years. Sophia's face drained of. No one spoke as I stood, picked up my coat, and thanked James. As I walked away, I felt something unexpected. Not victory. Relief. The aftermath. I left Riverstone Grill alone, pushing the heavy glass door open and stepping into the cool night air without looking back. The noise of the restaurant faded behind me, replaced by traffic and distant voices that had nothing to do with me. No one followed. No one called my name. I walked the length of the block slowly, my heels tapping against the pavement, aware of how tight my shoulders had been all evening and how that tension was finally easing. When I reached my car, I sat down and closed the door, but I didn't start the engine. I stayed there, hands resting in my lap, letting the moment settle instead of rushing away from it. For the first time that night, I breathed deeply. Not the careful breathing I used when I was trying to stay composed, but the kind that comes naturally when you're no longer bracing yourself. I didn't feel victorious. I didn't feel cruel. What I felt was quiet. The kind of quiet that doesn't demand anything from you. The next 48 hours passed without drama. I went to work as usual. I answered emails, returned calls, cooked dinner for myself, and slept through the night. I didn't replay the dinner in my head or imagine different outcomes. When Richard called to tell me that they had agreed to the restructuring terms, his voice was professional and steady. I thanked him, hung up, and noticed that my hands weren't shaking. There was no rush of satisfaction, no surge of relief, just the sense that something had been resolved exactly the way it needed to be. The paperwork moved forward smoothly. Everything stayed within proper channels, clean and unemotional. My children didn't argue or protest. They didn't apologize either. When they reached out afterward, their tone was different, more careful, more measured. They spoke to me as if they were aware, finally, that I was not just their mother, but a person with her own limits. It was awkward at first, but it was honest. And honesty felt better than comfort ever had. As weeks passed, I noticed how much space had opened up in my life. Evenings no longer felt like empty stretches I needed to fill with worry. I stopped checking my phone out of habit. I joined a small book club at the local library where people my age talked about novels, aging parents, and the strange freedom that comes with letting go of old expectations. I volunteered at a food pantry twice a month, sorting boxes and talking with people who knew nothing about my family and didn't need to. It felt good to be useful without being depended on. That fall, I took a short trip by myself, something I had never done before. Just a few quiet days near the coast. I walked along the shoreline in the mornings, sat on benches in the afternoons, and ate when I was hungry instead of when it was convenient for others. No one needed updates. No one needed reassurance. One afternoon, watching the water roll in and pull back again, I thought about that birthday night, about the candle I had blown out alone, about the version of myself who believed love meant waiting patiently and accepting disappointment without complaint. I didn't judge her. I understood her. She had done what she knew how to do. What I know now is simpler and harder. Family does not mean unlimited access. Love cannot survive on assumption alone. Respect is not inherited just because blood connects you. It is built, maintained, and sometimes reclaimed through boundaries drawn later than they should have been. My children are still part of my life.
We speak.
We see each other. But the relationship has changed shape. And that change has brought balance instead of resentment. I didn't lose my family the night I walked out of that restaurant. I lost the illusion that being needed was the same as being valued. And in letting go of that illusion, I gained something steady and lasting. I gained peace. Not through sacrifice or silence, but by finally choosing myself without apology.